Hello there. Welcome to the High Level Games Government Shutdown live stream. I am Josh Heath. I am the Chief Operations Officer of High Level Games. I'm a game designer, writer, editor, person about town when it comes to games. I've been in the industry for about 9 years now, going on 10 pretty soon. And I've got a lot of experience doing creation of games, tabletop role playing games and board games, but mostly tabletop role playing games for various games, systems, etc. Out there. So I am talking today. We've done 3 of these so far. First one was about mechanics in a general sense. I talked about a few different types of mechanics. Second one was about May I Enter specifically, which is the most recent game that I produced. And today we're going to be talking about settings. So when I mean setting, I mean both settings that are created for games that already exist and settings for your own game, right? If you have a game that is completely your own design from mechanics all the way up, there's a setting in there as well. There are relatively few games with zero setting. And by setting, I mean, right, the fiction of the world that the characters the players are playing exist within, right? In a tabletop role playing game, you're telling a story together. So by telling that story together, you have to have a place for the story to occur, right? That is how stories work. I don't mean to overgeneralize that, but in a story, right, there's a place that things happen. That place is your setting. So, keeping that in mind, I'm just checking my mic output really quickly. It was spiking a lot higher than it has been recently. So, I'm a little loud today. I apologize. So, setting, right? Setting is the place your game is occurring, the world you are building as a writer to help people set their game. Um, Even games as small as a single page largely have a setting, right? In your mechanics may support your setting. Your mechanics may be something you built largely separate from the setting, but the setting is the place where that fiction occurs, and without it, it's hard for players, it's hard for game masters to run your game, right? There are generic RPG systems as well, and these generic systems are designed to be used in any setting. You can create any setting and use those mechanics, at least in theory, right? But even if the game itself is one of those few games that doesn't have a setting of any sort, then you, as the game master, a narrator, a storyteller, a game master, has to create some form of setting for the story to occur. And this setting can be anything, right? There are games of every genre, every setting imaginable. There are Wild West games, there are Dark Ages games, there are games set in modern day Africa, right? There are games set in modern day New York. There are games that are sci fi games set in both a future or an alternative universe that just doesn't exist, right? There are the classic Dungeons and Dragons fantasy settings as well, right? There are more settings than I could talk about in the time that we have. And that's okay. Just like the mechanics, there were much more I could have said about mechanics, much more than I necessarily would have wanted to say about mechanics, but I could have gone on and on about mechanics for a long time. I can kind of go the same way about settings, right? But when you are writing a game, your setting is one of those things that you have to create in some form, but you get to decide how much setting you create and how much setting you infer, right? For example, there is a setting, the setting of May I Enter. I'll just use that. May I Enter is a good example. May I Enter setting is the modern world, except vampires live within it, right? And vampires and other supernatural beings are out there, and they have had some influence on the world, but largely things have ended up very similar to where we are in the real world in 2025, right? So your setting is that it is the modern world, but X exists. but we do a lot of inference of things in the way we wrote the setting, right? We give you some unreliable narrators. We tell you a few things that occurred. Those things may not be true, right? We infer, we create the space for the inference that the world is just like our own, but we don't ever tell you that explicitly. We don't really deny that explicitly. So your world can be 2025, or it can be something different, right? You can set it historical, or you can have things be different in your world in 2025 than are true in our current world, right? There was a Werewolf the Apocalypse game that I'm running that we started during the COVID shutdowns, right, during the pandemic, and we decided that COVID wasn't going to be an element of the setting of the world, even though otherwise it's a modern world setting and most things occurring in 2025 are occurring in our game world. But we decided that we didn't want to deal with the pandemic as a plot line in the game, so we didn't, right? It's not a thing that occurred in the world. And that's a simple type of setting element that you can build in, right? In building your setting, you have to decide, are you going to fully detail your setting, or as much as you possibly can, or are you going to create those inference spaces? And there are great settings that do one or the other, or a little of both, right? There are some settings, Planescape is an example of a setting that has lots of things detailed, right? There are so many books that have been produced for it, that Planescape, a setting for Dungeons and Dragons, has space, right, for you to fill in the blanks, but it's got tons of stuff to hook your ideas on, tons of things for you to generate story from, because there's so much setting, right? This is true. This was the traditional mode for most Dungeons and Dragons setting modules, right? You get initially a kind of a broad overview of the setting, and then they released individual supplements that really detail it well. Vampire the Masquerade did this, right, with its metaplot books. There are hundreds of books within the World of Darkness for the games that White Wolf produced that tell you lots of details about the setting, right? Lots of individuals, lots of characters with different things going on, lots of mechanics, lots of stuff that those creatures are doing that you can either bring into your game or not, but it's a lot of stuff to work with, right? Then there are games that have very low setting details, right? They are games like Pugmire, for example. Pugmire is a game where you play dogs in a fantasy world that's technically a sci-fi world. It's fantastic. It's one of my favorite games. Pugmire gives you just enough detail, right? It says there's a city of Pugmire. It gives you a little bit of information about places in the city, but it doesn't over describe Pugmire the city. It doesn't overly describe places like Waterdog Port or places in the Monarchies of Mao, which is the cat kingdom that's nearby. It gives you a broad brushstroke of ideas of places. The map even is a little, it's fuzzy. Not literally fuzzy, but it's not incredibly detailed. It's got lots of space in it, so you as the players and you as the game master can create more of your own story within that white space. And it's funny, I use the term white space because that's what you have on a page, right, to indicate there's lots of information. It doesn't have a lot of white space, right? The page is white, and the spaces around that are where you can infer, you can add different ideas into your setting. But it's not good or bad, right? Depending on which way you go. There are some players that will ask you to give them more. I really mean it. Like, there are people out there who will beg for more details about absolutely everything, regardless of how much you produce, right? I supported the production of a D&D setting called Snowhaven, written by my friend Justin Weaver, and we had a bunch of other people kind of help add to the lore of the setting for the book that we produced. I loved Justin's kind of initial 20 to 30,000 words that he produced. It was this gritty gritty city on the edge of ice, right? Barely surviving in the middle of the this wintry setting. And Snowhaven is a steam techy, hyper political place, right? And Justin's original vision was that kind of slightly grim dark esque snowpunk is what the term we ended up going with it, right? And that fit. We added some things to it that added a little bit of lightness to the setting, right? It added a little bit of additional, I'm not going to say depth, additional, like less than grim darkness elements to it with some other writers' input, including a Yeti species where you play the Yetu. Yetu are a species of sentient Yetis that you can play as characters, right? Those elements adjusted the setting a little bit. They shifted it slightly. And you can read what's written and you can run the slightly more grimdark setting with all the information and then add some of those more, those lighter elements in, or ignore them, right? They're there as opportunity space. But we detailed a significant amount of the city, and there were still people that were like, oh, can you tell us more about this specific street within the city on this map, right? And that's, you will get that. You will get that. You will have people asking for you, but you don't need to provide it. My recommendation to you is be comfortable with allowing some things to be unsaid. When you are developing your setting, you need to know what your bare minimum amount of information to provide to people is, right? If you're creating a superhero RPG, you need to give the players what creates superheroes, right? What is it that allows superheroes to exist in this setting that are not present in the real world? For example, maybe all your superheroes are some form of mutant, right? In the Trinity Continuum and Aberrant, all superheroes are human beings with these MR nodes, depending on the edition, either an MR node inside the head or MR nodes within the mitochondria that allow you to manipulate the quantum forces in the universe. That, honestly, is ridiculous, right? But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how ridiculous or scientifically accurate concept is. It just gives you a hook to work from, right? So everyone knows, okay, if I'm playing one of these superheroes, this is how I am created, right? This is how I have become a superhero, through this method. And that's, you can have a setting where you're like, okay, several superheroes are aliens, right? Or they use super tech to use powers, right? It doesn't matter per se, as long as you've got some explanation in a superhero setting for how your supers exist, why they exist, and what sort of things do they do, right? Those things you need to give people. You need to give them some adversaries to work against, right? So the setting's got to have both your good guys and bad guys for a superhero setting to work. But that's really vague, right? You can go in a lot of different ways with that. You see that in Champions, you see that in DC, you see that in Marvel, you see all the different ways that they can go about having superheroes work. Invincible, great example of giving you one example of how superheroes exist, right? With the aliens that the Invincible is connected to, but not all of them, right? Like, there are some supers in that universe where you're like, where did this person's powers come from? And they may or may not tell you, right? And that's fine. That's kind of that white space that you can build into your setting to allow people to create a character that just works for them. When you are devising your setting, it's going to dovetail to some degree with your genre. Your genre is going to influence your setting to some degree. For example, the preview image of this, the thumbnail image of this episode is a sticker that I made that says "I love horror tabletop RPGs," right? And horror RPGs assume some things, right? Horror is a genre, but it is not a setting, right? Horror assumes themes of things that make people uncomfortable or scared or frustrated or feel weird, right? Horror echoes, it evokes those concepts. That helps fulfill the genre element. And then your horror game could be set in the 1600s in colonial New England, right? You may be basing your game on on Plymouth Rock, right? On the interaction between settlers from England and the Native American peoples who lived in that region, right? That could be the basis. That could be the setting for your horror game, right? Which could be about cryptids that are slowly hunting, stalking, attempting to destroy and eat the settlers for whatever reason, right? They may or may not be engaged with eating other people as well. I'm just creating a setting in my head here, right? The setting is the place, it is the people, it is some of the tensions that exist, but it should evoke your genre, right? Your setting should feel like it fits into your genre. If you have a setting that is a sparkly, rainbow colored, let's see what's a good example, gymnasium, right? A school gymnasium that is rainbow colored, it is bright, there are multiple cheerleaders in there, and they're all extremely happy and excited. You can have that become a horror genre real quick, but it's going to take that brightness, the rainbows and everything, it's going to turn those into the opposite really quickly. But that's okay if that's what you're trying to set up. But your setting is going to have to fit your genre, or your setting will be destroyed by the genre you choose, right? If you use that same gymnasium, but it's a fantasy setting, one, you've got to explain how do gymnasiums exist in this fantasy world. Do they have cheerleaders? If they do, why? These aren't necessarily bad questions to ask. You may not have answers to these questions, right? But they'll come up. If your players are playing in a game and suddenly they're in a rainbow colored gymnasium and you've been playing a standard fantasy game that has evokes a medieval or faux medieval setting, they'll have questions, right? They may buy into it immediately. There are some great actual plays out there that mix settings, right? There's Fantasy High that Dimension 20 produced that mixes, the 1950s style school drama with your standard fantasy D&D sort of setting. And you can do that, right? But that is an intentional choice with your setting, that you are choosing different elements of different types of settings and genres and ideas, and you're winding them into what hopefully becomes a concrete, singular concept. But it's often, if this is your first game design rodeo, I encourage you to not genre mix, right? You can. I think genre mixing is fantastic. I think lots of people do it really well. But I always encourage people who are just starting out to start small, right? To start simple. To say, hey, I am going to produce a fantasy setting, right? It is a D&D knockoff setting. It's got all the standard D&D species. I'm using some different mechanics for it, but it fits that sort of setting and pulls on the fantasy genre. That is what I recommend more than doing a horror, fantasy, modern, urban slash traditional fantasy setting, right? You can do all of those things in that, but you can get lost really quickly in trying to design your first game as a multi-genre, as a multi-setting sort of thing. So when you are producing your setting, one of the other things that will be important for you to think about are how many figurehead characters you want, right? These are known by a lot of different names. Special non-player characters. There's a specific word that I'm trying to remember. It doesn't matter. But these sorts of non-player characters, these NPCs, they're important, right? Or not important, depending on how you want to build your game. Some settings don't have any named or signature NPCs at all, and that's totally okay. But many do, right? Many have like specific figures, either historically speaking or in the fiction, who exist in the world, right? Superman is an example of a signature character in a DC superheroes game, right? A player might play Superman, that is totally okay, but generally they're going to be an NPC that exists to support or antagonize or be against the players, right? And when you are developing your setting, you need to first decide if you're going to have any signature NPCs, and then decide what their influence on the setting is, right? Shadow Dark is a game that I just finished reading, and it's designed to be relatively light on the specifics when it comes to a setting. I can't think of any signature NPCs that exist in that world, but there will be adventures and things that are produced for that game that will have a signature NPC, right? That will have NPCs that you interact with, and maybe they will become the signature NPCs for the setting. That is one way of going about it, right? Where you slow roll any signature characters into the story, or you can decide like, hey, my setting needs some specific signature characters to exist. If you're setting your game in a academy for older teenagers, right? A horror academy for older teenagers that no way resembles Wednesday, right? If you're doing that, if you're going the Monster Hearts sort of route, the principal is probably a character that you would want to define, right? Or provide options for who the principal is of that school. Provide options for teachers who exist within the school, right? As a designer, you've got the opportunity to write as much or as little that helps people run and play your game. But you need to make sure you are including enough that helps people run and play your game. It can be really tough when you provide what feels like too little as a player, right? I have this issue a little bit. I like Urban Shadows, but I'm going to use it as an example. To me, Urban Shadows doesn't give enough specificity of the setting, right? It doesn't handhold enough for me for like a starting location. I'm a pretty, long-term GM at this point. I can make things up. I can write my own things. I certainly encourage you to do that, right? I'm not discounting that by any stretch of the imagination. But sometimes it would be nice to have like a solid suggested setting, right? That has solid NPCs. And there's a pre-made adventure that's in the book that gives a little bit of that. But this is the weird space where I'm at, where I want slightly more than that, right? Slightly more that is a solid setting for my games, because it helps percolate ideas up from the inside of my brain into a coherent story. And I think part of that is I grew up on RPGs that had strong meta plot, that had strong signature characters. The World of Darkness was absolutely my jam for a long time, and it's a filled world, right? It is a fully fleshed out. The world of darkness is crawling almost literally with monsters of various sort in various places, and it's hard to go anywhere without those signature NPCs sort of twisting, shaping, and changing the setting. But it's interesting because not every player agrees, not every GM agrees, and there are people who have been running Dungeons and Dragons, for example, for 20, 30, 40 years, totally their own settings. They have their own NPCs. The only thing they're using is the mechanics out of the book, and they're really not engaged in the setting at all, and that's totally cool, right? You can do that with any game as well, right? May Enter is a good example, right? Vampire game. You could run it with the mechanics as written, that all of your vampires are energy vampires, right? They're all Colin Robinsons, stealing people's energy in our game with consent. But that's a thing you could do, right? With the mechanics. You could just run your own setting using those mechanics. People do this with D&D. They make superhero games out of it. They make war games out of it. They do all kinds of different things. And that's a thing you can do, depending on how you're trying to build your setting. So some of the advice that I've provided so far is decide how much white space you're going to allow in your setting, right? How much you're going to explain, how much you're not going to explain, and how to create, signature characters that either help fill that out or provide just enough scaffolding for narrators, GMs to grab on and utilize those ideas. And I'm sure there's other suggestions I made. I just wanted to loop back and state those, right? And your settings gotta to mesh with your genre and or be crushed or be changed by your genre, right? There's nothing wrong, for example, with having a coffee shop in your traditional fantasy setting, right? I'm evoking a particular set of cozy novels by saying that, but that can fit, right? If it fits in your head, you can build that into the setting so that it makes sense, right? Ultimately, with a setting, you're producing the space that the story is supposed to occur in. The space where players build the things that they need to help tell their character backstory, right? Help build the ideas that they need to help figure out who their character is and how to portray that character. Your setting's going to give them that opportunity space. So some of my favorite settings, Dungeons and Dragons settings, for example, Birthright is one of my favorite settings, and it's a setting that's, again, it's got a lot of written content, but mostly I enjoyed the 4-year game of Birthright that I played, right? Where all of our player characters were the major cast, right? And there were some of these pre-built, pre-written NPCs that were in the setting, but we spent much less time with them than we did the NPCs that we created or that our game master created, right? And sometimes some of the characters on the edges were these pre-written ones just from the core book, because our GM didn't have all of the individual books for all of the individual domains within Birthright, which is also one of those things, right? You have to realize that a portion of your reader base will never buy a supplement. They'll just buy the core book, and if they run it, they'll just run the game out of your core book. So you may spend days, weeks, months building a supplement for a setting that you think people are going to use, and they never touch it, right? They never engage with it. I've saw this a ton of times with the World of Darkness, right? People would have the core book, they would run out of the core book, and there's nothing, zero wrong with that. but they don't have a deep understanding of Vancouver, right, in the World of Darkness, even though there's a major book and several other novels that touched on Vancouver. That's a major setting in the greater setting that people running the game may not have. So in your core book, you have to decide how much setting material has to go in that core book for people to get a feel for everything. And then you have to be comfortable with people choosing not to buy any additional supplemental information because they're going to design from there, right? They're going to build off of the framework that you gave them and create something totally different. And that's cool, right? Roll with that. That's amazing. Actually, that's kind of the thing you want, is for players to do like what people have done with Blades in the Dark, right? Blades in the Dark has a very specific setting of Duskfall, and that setting works for Blades in the Dark. It's not the only setting that can work for Blades in the Dark, of course not. And people have shown that, right? They've developed settings using Blades in the Dark that aren't Duskfall, right? That fit, that make sense. But Blades in the Dark was built mechanically to support the setting of Duskfall, right? I talked about this in the mechanics episode, our first episode, and mechanics should, right? Good mechanics help your genre, help your themes, help your setting live, right? They make the setting and genre feel like it's all connected in the grand scheme of things. And I think that connection, that linkage is your grand scheme goal with your setting, right? If you're building your own game, building your own setting, building your own mechanics, your mechanics should feel right for that setting. And if you're choosing other existing mechanic systems that are out there to scaffold to become the backbone of your game, totally valid, super support that, right? I am in no way saying negative things about that. Quite the opposite. I think that's totally okay. But just know that if you're using a pre-existing mechanical system, if you adjust your setting in a way that you don't have mechanics for, that means you either have to write them or you have to be comfortable with rulings to exist instead of rules, right? And I talked about rulings versus rules. I'll probably actually do a whole episode on that. So I don't know. I think actually I'm running out of steam today. I don't think I got a whole hour in me about this. I thought I might. I'm also a little more tired today than I have been. So I think I'm going to call this particular episode early. Hopefully I gave you some useful setting information, some feedback, some things that you can use. I told people before I did these live streams that I would be putting out a tip hat. I haven't done that yet because I'm doing fine so far during the shutdown. But if this persists for longer, I will be dropping my Venmo information and PayPal information and things like that in the comments. Please become a subscriber of High Level Games if you're enjoying these live streams. And check out May I Enter, check out Snowhaven. You can go to DriveThruRPG and look for High Level Games, and you'll be able to find us in our store. You can go to highlevelgames.ca, that's our website, and check out things that we are producing there. So thank you very much. Again, I've been Josh Heath. I will talk to you again tomorrow.